This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
6:48, and back to our top story tonight. Those negotiations set to take place between the United States and Russia over a Ukraine ceasefire deal. Now, there's one final bit of the jigsaw in all of this that really intrigues me, because Donald Trump is sending to negotiate with Putin not his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, not his special envoy for the conflict, General Keith Kellogg, but instead Steve Witkoff, a fellow property developer and Donald Trump's golf partner. Apparently, Putin feels that he can do very good business with Witkoff. Talk about showing your cards before the game has properly even begun. I'm joined now by LBC's Washington correspondent, Simon Marks. Is there any consternation or surprise or just weary shrugging in Washington about this particular choice?
Well, I think there's certainly surprise among foreign policy veterans here who would have assumed that negotiations with the Russians, as with the Ukrainians, would be carried out by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, or General Keith Kellogg, who, of course, was named by President Trump as his envoy to solve the crisis in Ukraine, Andrew. But in the event, Donald Trump has turned once again to Steve Witkoff. He's known Mr. Witkoff since the 1980s. They are absolutely peas in a pod. Politically, the only time they ever seem to face off against one another is on the golfing greens. And Steve Witkoff has already been to Russia in the past on Donald Trump's behalf, recently negotiating the release of Mark Fogel, that American citizen who was jailed on drugs charges in Russia, and bringing him home. So he's got established relationships there now, whether they are directly with Vladimir Putin or with lower level but still obviously very senior figures in the Russian capital is unclear. But he's certainly the man, unlike particularly General Kellogg, that the Russians are comfortable talking to.
And that, I guess, is the problem. If this is the person Putin wants to talk to, why would the Americans, give him what he wants in this case before the talks have even properly started?
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly the problem. But of course, Donald Trump. But of course, Donald Trump has given Vladimir Putin pretty much everything that he wants so far in the pre-game of negotiations that may eventually take place with Ukraine. Now, the American government will argue, look, President Trump feels comfortable. He trusts Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff has already proved his mettle, not just in Russia, but also in the Middle East. He's the man that Donald Trump sent to Tel Aviv at one point to give Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a dressing down when Benjamin Netanyahu was wavering on that ceasefire agreement in Gaza. And remember that Donald Trump, in his first term in office, didn't always use the orthodox path. His own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, became the Mr. Fix-It of that first Trump term. That seems to be the role that Steve Witkoff is auditioning for in the second term.
Over the last hour or so, we've seen Mr. Trump in the Oval Office with the Taoiseach for his visit to Washington. And there have been various comments, including Trump listing all the things he might do against Russia, mainly economic sanctions, the oil price and the rest of it, and trying to, at least to give the impression that there was a tough response if Russia simply ignored the ceasefire offer.
Yeah, and he's been giving that impression for several days. Remember that on social media a few days ago, he said he was seriously considering the imposition of fresh sanctions against Russia. But the serious consideration of fresh sanctions is very different than the imposition of those sanctions. And at no point did he condemn any of Russia's recent military activity in Ukraine. The Russians have been on the offensive very heavily over the last few days. And at one point, Donald Trump said that if he'd been in Vladimir Putin's position, he would have done exactly the same. So the language that the president has used publicly has been largely at variance with this idea that he is preparing to crack down on Russia. But he did say today it is up to Russia now. He said that if we can get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire, to the Ukrainian brokered ceasefire with the United States, that would get the United States 80% of the way to ending what President Trump referred to as this bloodbath. It's not clear that it really would get you 80% of the way to that, though, because we still don't know what security guarantees the United States is willing to offer Ukraine.
One hesitates to bandy statistics with the President of the United States, but I think 80% is piffle. Anyway, speaking of statistics, more on tariffs today. We've had counter tariffs from the EU and a strange U-turn when it comes to Canada. Meanwhile, Britain's saying that they're still considering whether to retaliate. Just bring us up to date on the view on tariffs at the moment from the White House.
Well, the view on tariffs remains that it's a very strong piece of President Trump's economic armoury. They're not walking back from the concept of this trade war at all. There's been a modest recovery so far this trading day on Wall Street by both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500. But after 4 days, was it, of non-stop losses, the markets need to see much more than a modest recovery. Donald Trump very much dismissive of the markets, talking about the animal spirit of market traders. At least one of his top officials was saying that the other day after those massive losses on Monday. But Trump absolutely standing by this notion that the trade war can create opportunities in the United States. This, they say, is simply an economy in transition, as the Treasury Secretary put it, detoxing from the Biden administration's approach to life and adjusting to Donald Trump's approach to life. Is that the way market traders really see it? Pretty uncertain.
Pretty uncertain. Simon Marks, the most effortlessly eloquent man in Washington. Thank you very much indeed for your help tonight.
Hi, Georgia.
Hi, David. What do you think the world needs more of?
Well, the world always needs more podcasts.
Didn't you used to have a podcast?
Not only did I used to have a podcast, Georgia, it's coming back. David Tennant Does a Podcast With Season 3. It's coming at you.
Okay, and who are your guests?
Who are my guests? What about Russell T Davis? What about Jamila Jamil? What about Stanley the Tooch Toochie?
So it's really just you hanging out with your mates then?
Yeah. Come, join me. David Tennant Does a Podcast With. Bye.